Hi, today we're going to delve into the story of a man who stood up against one of the most dangerous drug cartels in the world. He was a humble yet proud man who wasn't just about to let anyone take what was his or endanger those close to him. This is the story of Don Alejo Garza Damas. Born around 1933 in a small town of Allende in Nuevo León, Don Alejo was raised by a father who ran a sawmill, and from a young age, he learned how to chop down trees, prepare firewood, and so on and so forth, instilling in him a great respect for his own labor and the labor of others. And as he grew older, he started handling sales and deliveries to the nearby towns. As time would go on, his family business would thrive, so much so that they would open stores in both his birthplace, Allende, and Montemorelos. Now, this wasn't to say that Don Alejo was just some businessman, because he was much more than that. As time would go on and his business ventures would increase, he was proven to be a kind soul and eventually became the center point of the community, as he proved himself to be someone that could be counted on by both his friends and his employees. It would become commonplace to know that if he gave you his word, it was as solid as a contract. And he would become incredibly well liked within the area, as he would often go about and help people during the rough times of their life, altruistically. The man was truly a paragon. And this was especially true when, due to how trade was going on, the local plantations in Mexico and agriculture as a whole in that area took a rather harsh hit from new competition elsewhere. However, instead of doing what the average businessman would do and reap profits by benefiting off of the misery of others, Don Alejo stepped in, as he would go on to help the local plantation owners turn their plantations into chicken farms so they wouldn't lose everything, which caused many to recognize him as a man who would help them find their way out of a hole when even they couldn't see it. It is also really important for this narrative to note that Don Alejo was an avid outdoorsman, being both rather good at fishing and an incredibly proficient hunter. In large part, this is because they were hobbies that he had picked up as a kid and kept on into his adulthood. In fact, he was so dedicated and loved these hobbies that he actually helped start the local fishing, hunting, and shooting sports club in the area along with his friends. It was also noted that he had acquired throughout his life a rather sizable collection of sporting rifles. And eventually, with the family business doing rather well, Don Alejo and his brother would pool their money, allowing them to purchase a rather sizable parcel of land located about 15 kilometers from Ciudad Victoria. And here the brothers would split their land. Don Alejo specifically took the part known as San Jose Ranch, while his brother would take the remaining land. Here he would raise chickens along with other livestock, doing incredibly well with the local community by hiring almost exclusively locals to help him run things smoothly. All in all, this just shows you that Don Alejo was a true pillar of his community, but despite this, he was known to the community as being someone who strongly held onto the belief of standing their ground, no matter what, and unfortunately, that would wind up costing him. Now, November seemed completely normal, as during the week, Don Alejo would head back to his home in Allende in order to help his family run the business, but then return to his nice parcel of land during the weekends, always making his way back and forth, almost like clockwork. And it seems the weekends were his time to kick back, relax, and take it easy with his family, enjoying the fruits of his labor, along with the parcel of land he had poured so much into. Now at this point, he almost feels like a Mexican farming version of Mr. Rogers, and it seems he really was, as he took care of his family, his friends, the local community, and in general, everybody who knew him just adored the man. But unfortunately, things had to go down south, as everything turned to sepia and became a Western. Since Don Alejo was the hero of our story, it's only right that he would end up face to face with some bad guys. And mind you, there were some really, really bad guys. And that would come to happen on November 13th, 2010, when a handful of individuals from the infamous Los Zetas Cartel, let's put it kindly and say that they came knocking at the 77-year-old's door. And at this point, it seems that they didn't care about the man who was a pillar of his community, who had helped everybody around them, and probably them directly or indirectly, since they had their sights set on taking over his ranch. eyeing it as the perfect location for a drug running operation. So they showed up and demanded a rather generous donation from the old man, giving him 24 hours to comply. Now, I know being from the States, a gang telling you to leave or things would go wrong doesn't seem like much. But south of the border, gangs like Los Zetas are, the word evil doesn't quite encapsulate what they are, but they make the people from hostile look friendly. They will torture someone and have them begging for their lives while they're cutting their hands up and arms up slowly so they can feel the pain. They will decapitate somebody's entire family to prove a point to the local police. And they'll bring those decapitated heads and just station them in front of the police department. These were guys who used to work for the Gulf Cartel, using what amounted to military and terror tactics to get their job done. But eventually, they got a bit too rowdy for the Gulf Cartel to control, and in 2010, they broke off and became their own entity, calling themselves Los Zetas. By 2012, they had quickly taken over the gang activity of about half of Mexico. And once again, I cannot stress how brutal and overwhelming they were. They essentially functioned on scarier enemies with overwhelming brutality and force, so that the next people you ran into wouldn't even think of putting up a fight. Los Zetas were so bad that they essentially forced all the cartels in Mexico to become more violent in order to be able to compete, leading to violence skyrocketing and the use of military-grade weapons in almost all the cartels' activities. And Don Alejo was no stranger to these stories, as he knew perfectly well who they were. He had seen the rather horrid videos that the cartel members had produced and made public, and given the circumstances, neither you nor I would realistically be able to blame Don Alejo if he had just decided to cut his losses and skedaddle out of there. But despite knowing exactly what he was going up against, he wasn't just about to lay down and take it. So when Los Zetas essentially told him he had 24 hours to give it all up to them, he basically told them that they were going to have to pry it from his cold, dead hands. Something that they were rather amenable to. However, the answer itself seemed to stun them, as at this point they were not expecting a 77-year-old man to put up this much resistance. So rather than handing it over, he essentially rounded up all his farm workers that day and told them to take the day off. He wasn't going to be the cause of any of their suffering. Afterwards, he began to prepare almost in a John Wick style, taking all his firearms from his basement and preparing himself for the worst. At around 4 a.m. the next morning, the gang came armed to the teeth. And when I say armed to the teeth, this is by no means an exaggeration. High-powered firearms, grenades, explosives, fully automatic weapons, you name it. It seems that Don Alejo had struck up the hornet's nest, and essentially he just gave them the same reply. If you want it, you're gonna have to take it, which they did not take too well. So in an effort to get the old man to give up and to show him that they were serious, they fired at his property. Now, this overwhelming display of firepower and them showing that they're willing to use it would normally have worked. At this point, the people in Mexico were essentially rolling over to them. But to Don Alejo, them sounds like fighting words. And instead of shaking in his boots, he drew up his own pistol and gave the guy who fired upon his property a double lead injection, and took out another cartel member, dropping both of them on the spot faster than they could even realize it. This left the Los Zetas gang members completely stunned and befuddled, as they were just staring at two of their own dead on the ground, taken out by a 77-year-old rancher. They were so caught off guard that they froze and allowed him to reposition himself. But then chaos ensued. It was a firefight, bullets everywhere. And here you might think that their superior numbers and their trained tactics would allow Los Zetas to completely overwhelm Don Alejo, and it would have been a quick game over. But despite dumping round after round into the ranch, Don Alejo was able to reposition himself, and when the shooting finally stopped, as they were almost assuredly reloading, the Los Zetas noticed that now two more of their guys were on the ground, dead. Because while they were busy just spraying and praying, the old hunter picked off two young bucks as if they were nothing but game. And the gunfight would initiate again with renewed fervor, as two gunmen decided to charge at the front door and storm inside, expecting to catch the old man off guard by one of the windows. Unfortunately for them, experience proved to be a better teacher. And as soon as they busted in, they took some shotgun blasts. And guess what? Two more gang members were down. And guess what? They were now down two more gang members. At this point, they were starting to get rather frantic. The math was just not mathing for them. They were losing too many guys for too little gain. So now they brought out the big guns, high-powered rifles, and the grenades, as they were now attempting to basically smoke him out by destroying everything. And I mean everything. But the old man wasn't making it easy, as he kept them guessing by constantly shifting where he was shooting from, which made it extremely hard for them to pin him down. After about 5 minutes of this chaotic firefight, which would put Hollywood movies to shame, they bailed out of the ranch, likely because, well, they were too close to the state capital and they had just expended a ridiculous amount of resources attempting to take out one old man, and well, if the police got to them, they weren't exactly equipped anymore to handle them. And it wasn't really the police that they were worried about, since after such a display, it's likely that the army itself might show up. And eventually, the military did show up. In fact, it was the Mexican Marines and the Mexican Navy who would go in and finally enter the property. And what they found was a scene of utter devastation. The house had been turned to little more than Swiss cheese by over 900 rounds that had been fired at it and struck, along with what amounted to a silly amount of craters due to the grenades. And at this, the military was expecting to have found a small horde of ranchers holding up the fort, since they had to step over several dead gang members' bodies to even get inside. But once inside, rather than finding a small army of ranchers, they found an empty house littered with toppled guns and spent shell casings. And this caused them to worry, so they started to call people out in order to see if they could identify themselves, as the Marines at this point wanted to assure any survivors that it was safe to come out. However, they would get no response, which led them to searching the house more thoroughly. And eventually, they checked the bathroom, and they found Don Alejo slumped over on the floor. It seems that during the intense gunfight, he had been hit multiple times, but kept fighting, as his body was covered in an extreme amount of shrapnel from several grenades that had gone off near him. But apparently, before passing, he had prepared himself for a final stand by barricading the bathroom and getting ready to take out anybody who came in. Sadly, he passed away just prior to the Marines getting there. However, when they found him, he still had his rifle in his hand and his finger in the trigger, aimed at the door, ready to take a few more Los Zetas with him. Now, despite this story being what in the United States would have caused a media feeding frenzy, it seems that the local media decided to tamp down on the story, keep quiet about it, because at that point, Los Zetas had such a stronghold on the local government that speaking out against them, even if you were a journalist, would likely end with your face peeled off. Especially in this instance where the scary international criminal cartel was made to look pathetic and run away by a 77-year-old man with a couple rifles and a pistol. That is a humiliation which would have caused a severe blow to their street cred and their standing amongst the other cartels. However, the Milenio newspaper would report on these events, being the only ones with the fortitude, let's say, to actually report on the incident. And from here, the story quickly spread throughout Mexican social media sites. It essentially became viral in Mexico, transforming this beloved local man into a national figure, a hero, as his heroic last stand wasn't just about him fending off against close to a dozen heavily armed attackers. As for the Mexican people, it seemed to symbolize much more, since for decades, ordinary Mexicans had essentially been terrorized and crushed under the oppressive weight of the corrupt officials, along with the violent cartels who had taken over and made everybody's lives infinitely more miserable through constant threats, theft, murder, torture, along with property and home theft. Don Alejo's defense of his own ranch became a powerful symbol of resistance, as he stood up against both the corrupt system, which was allowing these men to run rampant, and a vile, violent gang of vicious marauders who were essentially left relatively untouched. And since his actions caused them to retreat with their tails tucked between their legs, his actions were viewed as a resounding victory, which left Los Zetas with a permanent black eye, since they would never return to San Jose Ranch again, having lost too many men and embarrassed themselves not only on a national, but on an international scale, especially since the cartel's efforts to silence the press seemed to actually backfire, as the regular press might have been kowtowed into silence, but the regular people of Mexico, they got the message. Los Zetas could be beaten. However, even with all the media attention and Don Alejo becoming a cultural hero, it seems that the officials couldn't be as brave as a 77-year-old man, as no official investigation into his murder would ever be launched. Despite Don Alejo being described by multiple news agencies as fighting with dignity, honor, and courage, not just for himself or his ranch, but for the people of Mexico, it seems nothing will be done by the government. However, the memory of Don Alejo has been kept alive through social media, along with songs, and even a movie, along with the fact that Los Zetas essentially pulled out of the area altogether. So he did, in essence, save the ranch. If you remained with me until the end, I thank you, and I do hope you stay tuned and subscribe for more content.